it'll be a rich irony, won't it, if we have a year or a year and a half of tariffs that knocks the US economy into a recession, and it turns out the whole darn enterprise was unconstitutional all along, which might then mean we have our first ever unconstitutional recession. Although the Supreme Court cannot reverse a recession and the damage the administration is doing.
Hello, I'm Fergus Macphee and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is Justin Wolfers, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. Justin, it's been a while since we last spoke, but every time we do, it means that tariffs are back in the news. How are you?
I'm well, and I heard you just had a birthday.
I may be able to confirm that, yes, I have had a birthday this week. Nothing significant, but...
Did you get an array of Chinese imports? Because when it was my birthday, no one could afford them anymore.
Oh, no, I got everything I've ever dreamed of.
Lovely.
We'll get straight into it. We're talking about those tariffs because last night, Donald Trump asked the US Supreme Court to overturn a court decision that found many of the tariffs illegal. It was only last week, I think, that the US Federal Appeals Court found by 7-4 that Trump had overstepped his presidential remit and that these were actually congressional powers. I believe that's a point that you've made personally quite a few times on this show. I know you must have been pleased when the judgment came through last week. How are you feeling today, knowing that it's now going to go to the Supreme Court?
Mate, I'm not pleased. I'm just here to call balls and strikes. Look, it's... First of all, I'm not a lawyer. But the power... So first of all, I wasn't the one saying this is a congressional power. The Constitution said it. It's just written there. Even an Australian in America understood that. So the state of civics education that people thought otherwise makes you worry. Look, the Constitution gives power over tariffs, and in fact all taxes, to Congress. Why is that? In this country, we don't like kings. We don't like it when the monarch levies taxes without representation from the people in the people's house. I know it's different over there, mate.
Ever so slightly, yes.
Yes. How is the king doing?
I think he's doing quite well.
Oh, lovely. Well, ask him if he's thinking about taxing you anytime soon. So we don't like that. But Congress also understands, so Congress owns the power over tariffs. Congress also understands that Congress is not very good at its job. I'm being kind of literal. Congress can be slow, it can be clunky, it can be divided, and so on. So every now and then what it will do is delegate some of its powers back to the White House. The White House doesn't have to have long debates. It can just do. And so when is it you would want to do that? Well, one possibility would be during an emergency. And so there's something called the Emergency Powers Act. The Emergency Powers Act says during an emergency, the White House can do a bunch of things. Okay, so there's two problems. The first is the Emergency Powers Act doesn't mention the word tariff. It's not there once. So if there were an emergency, the first question is, has Congress delegated that authority to the White House? And the court found that if it intended to do so, it would do so in big, bold letters. And the fact that the word tariff's not there is the opposite of big, bold letters. What's interesting is, of course, there's a whole second issue, which is even if the Emergency Powers Act applies, where's the emergency? Because if you can just come to power and say bilateral trade deficits between two countries, or a national emergency, well, we've had them with a bunch of countries every year since the founding of the country. Every country has at least some bilateral trade deficits. No economist alive would tell you a bilateral trade deficit is an emergency, and few would even tell you it's a problem. So again, he was relying on the Emergency Powers Act that doesn't mention tariffs, and he doesn't have an emergency. You can see why the lower courts were very unimpressed with this. They knocked the tariffs off, and then there was a stay which says, right, fine, we'll keep the tariffs on until you convince me that it's not. And then it went up to the Federal Appeals Court, who said, you don't have the power to do this, President Trump. President Trump freaked out, said, we'll not have a country. The problem with that argument is pretty transparent. The court said, you can tariff as much as you want. You just have to go to Congress first. And if it really were in the national interest to be tariffing the heck out of everyone, it shouldn't be too hard to convince Congress.
I guess constitutionally then, are there not measures in place that could have stopped this at the time? You know, like obviously now it's kind of almost going through the courts and they're saying this has been found to be unlawful. Why could those things not happen at the time that he imposed them in April?
Yeah, so the great irony, right, is this now goes up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will sit around for a while. If they do as I hope, expect, and I think a reading of the law would suggest, and rule them illegal, then finally the tariffs will get turned off. They might get turned off as late as mid-2026.
Do you think that's the most likely outcome, that they do?
First of all, I'm not a lawyer. But look, everyone has different theories about the Supreme Court. If your theory is that they're political toadies, they will do whatever Tim Trump says, then of course it'll rule his way. If you think that they're moderately honest lawyers trying to find their way through the muddle of the law informed by ideological preferences, as I do, then you would think when the law is so darn clear, you've got no choice. But honestly, ask a lawyer. It'll be a rich irony, won't it, if we have a year or a year and a half of tariffs that knocks the US economy into a recession, and it turns out the whole darn enterprise was unconstitutional all along, which might then mean we have our first ever unconstitutional recession. Although the Supreme Court cannot reverse a recession and the damage the administration is doing. To take your question seriously, historically what the White House would do, historically presidents were committed to the Constitution. And before they move forward with a particular action, they can't ask the Supreme Court what's going on, but they spend a lot of time trying to make sure that what they're doing is something that's constitutional and legal. This seems to be move first, ask questions later. So I've never seen any previous administration act the way these guys do. And so, yeah, I think we're actually seeing a failure of the legal system in a fairly fundamental sense. And this is not just about tariffs. There are an enormous number of actions, from cracking down on universities to firing folks to starting new government departments, but not calling them departments. I'm thinking about DOGE. And on and on and on it goes, where it doesn't look like they have the power and they just do things. So I think this is sort of the Uber version of government. Although Uber, of course, turns out to be a wonderful service. I'm less sure about the administration.
And if the Supreme Court, I'll try and get it back onto economics slightly more. If the Supreme Court do find against the president, I mean, is that a situation would the US would have to pay back all the tariff revenue?
It remains unclear, but that remains very possible. In which case, people who paid tariff revenue have a receipt, and those receipts become really valuable.
30-day money-back guarantee.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's already now secondary markets in those receipts. So if you've got a $100 receipt, you can currently sell it to someone for, say, $30. And that would tell you that the market thought there was around about a 30% chance that they get repaid. I'm not sure of the exact price these are trading at. I'm not sure whether to call it a rich irony or a sign of corruption or just a sign of our times. Those receipts are being highly traded by Cantor Fitzgerald, which is the Secretary of Commerce's former firm where his sons work. All I'm going to do is sigh.
Are you seeing anything within this administration that implies they have a backup plan if that does happen?
So they do have a very clear and obvious backup plan in the short run, and the longer run's much less clear. So remember, what will be found here is the Emergency Powers Act does not give the White House the power. Now, there are other times that Congress has delegated power to the White House. So one is what's called anti-dumping, where we worry that a foreign country is selling stuff cheap just because they want to drive our guys bust, and then they'll come in and jack up their prices. And so there's also a delegation on national security. And so what the Emergency Powers Act did was it allowed Trump to levy tariffs country by country by country. You could also, and so if that's ruled illegal, all the country-specific tariffs, fentanyl tariffs on China, Canada, Mexico, and then what Trump called reciprocal tariffs, which were made-up tariffs on every country. That's actually the majority of the Trump agenda. But separately, think about the world in verticals, where a vertical is an industry. And so we have tariffs on steel and aluminium. Now, those are not under challenge as part of this lawsuit. With those, there are a less nimble instrument, which is the government has to launch an investigation. The investigation then comes back and says, oh, this is a threat to America, and then you can levy the tariffs. Now, it's a bit of a Mickey Mouse investigation, which is if you tell your Commerce Secretary or that you want this, they tend to do an investigation and tells you what you want to hear, but it takes several months. And you might think, well, in a sane administration, that's just process. That wouldn't make a difference. But remember, the president likes to just wake up and change things. And so maybe it makes the thing less attractive. So it would probably lead to a shift away from country tariffs to these industry tariffs. There is another power where you can levy tariffs against a country, I think for up to 6 months, maybe it's 7. And then after that, you have to go to Congress for approval. So the day after the Supreme Court rules it illegal, they'll probably roll all these over using that 6-month power. And then they'll be forced to move industry by industry. So Tariff Man gets to continue being Tariff Man.
And I think last night he was sort of speaking in the Oval Office, and he said that also there might be a situation where the administration has to unwind sort of current deals that have been done with the EU, Japan, and South Korea. So presumably, I mean, would that basically just go back to where we were in January 2025, December 2024?
Which deals, Fergus?
We're covering old ground here, aren't we?
Yeah. So these deals are mostly window dressing. They're largely voluntary. They have not gone through parliaments in foreign countries, and they've certainly not gone through Congress in the United States. So there's sort of like a handshake plus a press conference, and there's less there than you might hope. This does give you a sense of why it was so difficult for anyone to strike a deal, which is the president was threatening a bunch of things that were unconstitutional, and you didn't need to be a constitutional lawyer to figure that out. His cudgel, apart from the fact, so his cudgel was unconstitutional, and then he would use it in a fairly arbitrary way where he'd make a deal and then ask British steel manufacturers how they're feeling about the fact that Keir Starmer told them that he had a 0% tariff on British steel.
Last point on the tariffs. We'll go back to Congress, because I know you said last week that all the president has to do is to convince the Republican-led Congress to impose tariffs. He seems incredibly reluctant to do that. Presumably, he thinks he can't do that.
There's 2 things here. 3 things. It's a rich irony. This man comes from a party called the Republican Party. He prefers to act like a king, the opposite of a republic. And so consulting with Congress, ask a psychiatrist if that's what's going on, not an economist, but I do just want to point out that it moves towards true democracy and away from, or towards a true republic and away from a monarchy. It's hard work. Like working with Congress, they're a pain in the ass. There's 435 of them. They've got different interests. Everyone wants a special carve out. They want you to shake hands. It's usually the work of a White House. A White House has huge numbers of people who work on congressional affairs, who were back and forth between Capitol Hill and the White House. And, we talk about great presidents sometimes as people who are masters of getting Congress in order. But it's just an enormous, enormous amount of work. It's a huge part of legislating. And as far as I can tell, this is the laziest White House I've ever seen. When it comes time to do homework, the homework never gets done. Howard Lutnick has never, ever gotten something done on the day he said he would. And so maybe these guys are just not constitutionally, by which I mean their constitution, prepared for it. But then, the problem, it's not going to get through. Why is it not going to get through? Because it's a bad policy. And you don't need many congressional representatives to stand up against a bad policy for it not to pass. It's not going to be bipartisan. The Republican majority is razor thin. They've been totally cowed to going, to doing whatever the president wants. But once you get down to the level of an individual district, if that's a district whose jobs are being threatened by tariffs, and many are, you now have a very hard choice: stand up for your district or stand up against the president. And this is before you get to the fact that some of these guys are actually sort of Chamber of Commerce types who think that global trade is a good thing. So no, the problem the president faces is he has an immensely unpopular set of policies because they're incoherent and damaging, and the only way to get them through is by avoiding Congress.
And speed does seem to be of the essence, because he's even asked for an incredibly speedy review from the Supreme Court. He wants them to review the case by the 10th of September and see whether to take it on, which currently is 6 days away. I mean, I guess there is a scenario where they could say no, and then within 6 days this would sort of, this would all be over.
No, it wouldn't. They would then have to hear the case. And then they would have to decide on what timeline they wanted to issue an opinion. So the really great news about this, Fergus, I've been missing you. And this will give me many more opportunities to talk with you, because tariffs and the legality of tariffs and the economic consequences of the on-again, off-again, incoherent story that moves from one quite bizarre chapter to the next, we're nowhere near the end of this novel, brother.
We'll end with something else then. I know you've spoken about previously and you're quite passionate about as someone who works at a university yourself. But Donald Trump's in more legal difficulties because a federal judge has overturned over $2 billion in funding cuts to Harvard. The White House says that it will appeal, as we've just been through. And they did accuse Judge Alison Burroughs, who was appointed by Barack Obama, of being an activist. A little like the tariffs. I mean, is this something that's just going to rumble on through the courts?
So there's a narrow issue and a broad issue here. The narrow issue is Trump. So the thing to remember is, in the United States, universities are private organizations, privately owned, privately held. And there's a bunch of private organizations, and Trump, who is from a party that historically had libertarian roots, has decided that the government should be right in their business and has done everything he can to shut them down under the pretext of anti-Semitism, while filling government offices with anti-Semites. So I'm glad you didn't introduce it using the pretense. He's just attacking these institutions. So big win for Harvard. It's fairly clear that this is, at a minimum, unethical, outside of traditional Republican thinking. It's not remotely clear why a president would have the right to walk in and tell a private institution who to hire and what to teach in a syllabus. It's extraordinary government overreach, and it's great to see it get pushed back. There's a one step broader, is innovation is one of the great driving forces of the American and global economy. And the incubator for innovation is that we have many of the world's leading universities here. And it's a rich irony that our greatest engines he's been going after, that are responsible for so many patents and so many brilliant ideas that are not only inventing AI and technological change, but cures for cancer and vaccines, that's who he's been going after. But there's an even broader thing, which is the role of government in private life. And so remember, this is a president who not only is telling Harvard who to hire, but is telling Cracker Barrel what logo to use, Coca-Cola what kind of sweetener to use, Intel who should be its CEO, and on the list goes. Much of this is soft power, fear of what the president could do. Congress doesn't give him a ton of power because we are actually sort of meant to be kind of a free-ish market, and you're meant to leave people alone. And here we've been told the soft power is backed by threats. I can take billions away. And the courts are saying, actually, that threat's nonsense. So my hope, which is not my expectation, my hope is this is the brushback pitch that which, by the way, is a little bit like, it's like a bumper, a bouncer, a brushback pitch. Isn't it good? I'm bilingual. That this is the brushback pitch, which gives others courage to stand up and assert their legal rights to continue to operate as the organizations they are.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I know that other Ivy League institutions, I think Columbia, Penn and Brown, am I right that they did strike deals at the time to sort of protect the funding that they had? So where does this leave them?
It's extraordinarily difficult to say what any of those institutions did because there is an enormous lack of transparency. It does look like they've done things to buy off the president and buy off they haven't sent him money to his pocket, but they've put resources towards the president's policy priorities. It's a very difficult calculation. Many of my colleagues are outraged that these universities did that. I share some element of the outrage while feeling immense empathy that these university presidents have huge staff numbers, student numbers, entire communities dependent on the continued operation of the university, and you can stand up for principle, but sometimes you might get beaten up.